In the early hours of July 30th, 1916, residents of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania woke up in their beds when their bedrooms began to shake. They could hear a faint bang in the distance, but didn't really know what it was. All they could really be thinking was, are we experiencing an earthquake? Even though this rumbling did register a 5.5 on the Richter scale, which would be a pretty sizable earthquake, that's not what was happening here. Nearly 100 miles away, America had just experienced its first terrorist attack. This is going to be one of those strange stories that you listen to and wonder how the heck you've never heard of this before. It doesn't get taught in schools for some reason, even though it was the reason the Espionage Act was created in 1917. It's why we have several domestic intelligence agencies. It's one of the early stepping stones for why the United States joined the First World War. And you're not allowed to visit the Statue of Liberty's torch anymore because of this event. And yet, somehow, it seems like nobody's heard of it. So without further ado, let's get into today's story. World War I began on July 28, 1914, after Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia because of the assassination, and it wasn't before long that many European countries were choosing sides and fighting with one another. Russia sided with Serbia, while Germany sided with Austria-Hungary, but because France sided with Russia, Germany declared war on France, and Britain supported France, so they declared war on Germany. It was a true domino effect that America wanted no part of. After all, the last battle on American soil was the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1890. Less than 700 people had fought in that. The U.S. was not interested in having troops fighting in their country. President Woodrow Wilson had the support of the American people to remain neutral during the war. Nearly 10% of Americans identified as ethnic Germans and did not wish to enter the war due to conflict of interest. Now, an important note we need to make here is that the British implemented a naval blockade against Germany and their allies. What does that mean? That means they were restricting maritime supply of goods, like food, weapons, communications, people. That means that bodies of water would be declared war zones. So if you were an unsuspecting ship that happened to be passing through, you could be sunk without warning. When the RMS Lusitania left from New York in 1915, all of the passengers had been warned to make the trip at their own risk because the ship could easily be attacked. Still, the boat left anyway, and on May 7, 1915, it was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20. Nearly 1,200 people were killed, including 128 Americans. So now Woodrow Wilson was left with a tough decision. This wasn't an attack on America, and these people did leave the country knowing the risk, so should the United States enter the war if over 100 Americans died at the hands of the war? The public was starting to change their opinions, but Woodrow Wilson stayed firm in his belief that the U.S. should stay out of it. But were they actually staying out of it? Not really. In the New York harbor just west of Liberty Island, or Bedloes Island at the time, was an artificial island created by landfill. It was called Black Tom Island. Now, I've seen a number of different explanations as to how this island got its name. They range from being named after a dark-skinned fisherman to it looking like a black tomcat if viewed from above. So how it got its name, I don't know for certain. What I do know for certain is that the island had this big munitions depot. The depot had literal tons of military weapons available for purchase to any buyer, meaning if Britain wanted to buy weapons from there, they could. If Germany wanted to buy weapons from there, they could. They had been doing this since the beginning of the war. But here's the thing. Once this naval blockade was in place by the British, it was impossible for the Germans to import these weapons. So what does it look like on paper? Well, it looks like the Americans are choosing sides and supporting the Allied governments and not the Central Powers. Germany even called them out on this. They said you shouldn't be profiting from a war that you aren't part of. But still, the United States continued to send exports to Great Britain, France, and Russia. And because of this, Germany felt like they needed to respond. And something they realized was that the United States had no real federal regulations regarding espionage. And more importantly, the US had no agencies that had the resources to protect the country from that kind of attack. Germany had already begun these tactics by the time the Lusitania sank. German agents were already placing cigar-shaped firebombs on Europe-bound vessels, designed to go off once the boats were out on the open sea. And because these accidents were investigated by different kinds of agencies based on where the ships were coming from, nobody really connected that it was German agents responsible for all of it. Once the Lusitania sank, President Wilson did start investigating espionage in the country, and they found some early success. A number of German saboteurs were arrested in both New York and New Jersey. And for a little while, this stopped the cigar bombs. But those agents were quickly replaced, and the cycle began anew. However, there were people of the thought process that they should be looking into grander scale sabotage. And that's when their attention turned from cigar bombing ships to targeting munitions factories and storage depots. And the biggest target of them all was Black Tom Island. It could be argued that Black Tom Island had the largest stockpile of military-grade ammunition outside of Europe. This island was also very accessible. It's called an island, but in reality, it wasn't. It was a peninsula that stuck out from New Jersey's edge. The site was a rail-to-ship terminal and could easily be accessed by water or by land. And on top of that, it was barely guarded at all. Any person walking the street could easily find it by accident. So the Germans knew exactly what area they wanted to hit. It was just a matter of finding someone to do it. And that's when they found Michael Christoph. Michael Christoph was a 23-year-old Austrian immigrant who was working at an oil company just a few miles away from Black Tom Island. History remembers him for being slow-witted, easily manipulated, and eager to stop the war. Because of his job and vicinity to the storage depot, Michael was a familiar face to those who worked at Black Tom Island, whether you worked in the depot or you were a security guard. It was like the stars aligned for Germany. This was the perfect person for the job. On July 30th, 1916, a little after midnight, Michael went to the island. He followed the railroad tracks, passing nearly 70 train cars, all loaded with munitions. We're talking like 2 million pounds worth of munitions. When he got to the water's edge, he was met by two more saboteurs named Kurt Janke and Lothar Witzke. Kurt was an American citizen with connections to the German consulate in San Francisco. Lothar was a naval officer with an intelligence background, and each of these men had explosives with them. They went to a nearby barge that had 100,000 pounds of dynamite, and they placed explosives there. They went to the railroad cars and placed them there. And from there, they set a small fire that they knew would spread. And once it was set, they left the way they came and just waited. While this was going on, a man named Owen Fitzpatrick was sitting at his chair in the Ellis Island Immigration Center. He was a telephone operator. He watched as thousands of people per day were processed and welcomed to America, and people were still in line to process despite the late hour. Again, it's a little after midnight. However, in a moment, they'd need to be evacuated. That fire spread to the first bit of explosives at Black Tom Island, and in an instant, Owen was thrown from his chair across the room and into the hall. Glass showered him from above. 4 shells of 3-inch caliber fell on the gravel path in front of the main door, and another shell passed through the roof of the coal bunker attached to the powerhouse. Windows shattered all throughout Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, New Jersey. People would feel these shockwaves as far as Baltimore, Maryland, which is nearly 250 miles away from New York City. More and more explosions occurred over the next few hours, and this chain reaction had the watchmen at the Woolworth Building, which was the tallest building in the world at the time, get on their knees and pray because they were convinced that the world was ending. Hundreds of people were injured, but only a few were actually ever officially listed as having died from the Black Tom explosion. This actually included a 10-week-old infant who had been thrown from his crib over a mile away. The property damage was catastrophic. They needed to check the structural integrity of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty. The statue closed, and it's estimated that the property damage was somewhere around $20 million, which today would be well over $400 million. When an investigation was first launched, the first people that were looked at were the security guards. These guards actually admitted that they had set smudge pot fires to try to shoo away all of the annoying mosquitoes that like to hang around the landfill, and they were actually blaming themselves, thinking that these smudge pot fires had somehow accidentally had some hand in this. Now, we don't know for sure if the security guards were in on the scheme, since Michael did basically walk right by them to get in and out of the island, but the investigators determined that these pot fires would have been too far from the TNT for that to have been responsible for the explosions. The government reported that the event was an accident, but the investigation continued. Meanwhile, a Hoboken landlord reported to the police that one of her tenants had been acting very strange on the morning of the explosion. He had been pacing with his hands over his head, questioning, what did I do? What did I do? And this tenant was Michael Kristof. He was arrested in April. There was one huge problem, though. It was 300 by 150 feet large. There was this massive crater where 6 piers, 13 warehouses, and dozens of railroad cars had straight up disappeared. All that was left was debris and contaminated water. It was impossible to prove how the explosion happened. They had no reliable witnesses, and the evidence was circumstantial. And so shortly after he was arrested, Michael Kristof was released. And even though it seemed pretty convincing that Germany had played a hand in this explosion, Woodrow Wilson continued his policy of neutrality, likely because of the explosion's proximity to the 1916 election. He didn't think he would win again if he entered the war right before the election, so agents just continued to surveil Michael, shadowing him at every turn, and then they followed others believed to be spies in the country too. Woodrow Wilson was then re-elected president. When we get to the springtime, though, Michael Kristof disappeared. Nobody knew where he went. However, he disappeared after spilling his secrets to an undercover detective named Alexander Kastman. And it's really through Alexander that we have the details of what happened there at all, although it is a story being told by Michael. Michael claims that the funding for the operation came from a Bayonne, New Jersey resident named David Grossman. Alexander arranged for Michael to introduce him to David, and David confirmed that he had given them money, but didn't know what it was going to be for. However, what Alexander was able to get out of David was Kurt and Luthar's names. But just like Michael, they too had disappeared. Before any of them were seen again, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Russia had pulled out of the war because of their own political revolutions, and the Allies were struggling to win this war. They needed people. So Congress began to increase the military budget, and right around the same exact time, the British intercepted the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a coded message to Mexico from Germany, informing them that they would offer United States land to Mexico if they joined the war and attacked the US. So it was impossible to avoid war at this point, and while President Wilson was writing up the proclamation of war, a German torpedo sunk the American steamship Aztec. On April 6, 1917, the US officially joined the war. At this point, Kurt and Luther were in Mexico City hiding out. Eventually, Kurt found his way back to Germany, where he acted as an intelligence agent for the Nazi regime. But time passed by, and eventually he was captured by the Soviets and was executed in 1950. Luther was less careful and was arrested by the US Army. He too was sentenced to death, but the sentence was later reduced to life in prison. That happened once the war was over, and Germany was arguing with the US that he should be released from prison, because they had released all prisoners of war, including spies, as had many other nations. Luther also heroically sacrificed his well-being in prison after a boiler exploded and helped to prevent a disaster. And because of these things, the US did in fact release him. He was pardoned by President Coolidge and returned to Berlin. As for Michael, he was arrested several times for unrelated crimes after the war. Whenever he was questioned more about the Black Tom Island explosion, but he never spoke a word about it while in custody. He died in 1928 from tuberculosis. The railroad company that was using Black Tom Island sued Germany for $20 million and finally won in international court in 1939. Germany had other things on its mind in 1939, though, as they invaded Poland, sparking World War II in September of that year. They didn't agree to pay restitution until 1953, when the price had risen to $50 million for inflation, which would be somewhere north of $450 million today. The railroad company received their final payment in 1979. The site of Black Tom Island is currently Liberty State Park in New Jersey, and there you can find a historical sign marking the site of the explosions. As for the Statue of Liberty, that reopened. However, the explosion weakened the arm holding the torch, and for that reason, the only people allowed up there now are the maintenance workers. Today, by appointment, the highest you're allowed to climb in the statue is the crown. So, that's going to do it, folks. I'm really curious how many of you were familiar with this story before hearing me talk about it just now. How is this a subject that's never taught in any schools? I only know about it because I wanted to know why people couldn't visit the torch. That's it. Nobody told me about it. It was information that I accidentally taught myself. So I'd be really curious to know how many of you are just hearing about this for the first time. Please, let me know in the comments section below. Please, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course, I'll catch you all in the next one. Deuces, kids.